Hi, thanks for joining me today. I am Sharmen with the Marriage Recovery Center, where we work with high conflict couples who are trying to sort through the chaos and the destruction in their relationships to find some sense of hope and healing and reconnection. Today, what I want to talk about a little bit are some of the roadblocks to change, and to talk about it particularly from a woman's point of view, a woman's perspective, because I often end up helping a lot of women, particularly on a pathway to healing. And so I want to just talk about this for a moment from a woman's perspective. So generally speaking, they say that people change when the pain of staying the same becomes greater than the pain of changing. They change when they have to become more self-protective and to self-preserve. In other words, if you're in a traumatic environment, a unsafe, unstable environment, again, staying the same is probably dangerous and going to be painful. We learn to change in order to be self-protective and to self-preserve. In other words, to stay safe and to get what we want. People change when it is their idea. Meaning, as women, we try to influence and instigate all kinds of change, motivate all kinds of change in the people around us, particularly our spouse, because of our need and our motivation. But if we are always the one trying to initiate change in someone else, it isn't going to be very deep or very effective because of free will. Once free will is taken out of the picture, everything ceases to be meaningful. And so if it's not an idea coming freely from your spouse about the need to change, then it's not going to be deep and meaningful. The convoluted part of that is that we have such a desire in us to see them want to change because of what we're asking and how we're hurting, or what we see needs to be different, that when they don't, it is very traumatizing. However, that doesn't take away the necessity for there to be free will. So people change when the pain of staying the same becomes greater than the pain of changing. They change when they have to because of self-protection and self-preservation. And they change when it is their idea. Some of the roadblocks that get in the way are things like an inability to regulate one's own emotions, an inability to say what you really need to say, to mean what you say and to say what you mean, being reactive, which is another thing that trauma creates for us, is a reactivity that makes it very hard for there to be healing change. And I would also say there's also roadblocks that come about because of our own belief systems. Like if we don't believe that it matters what we say, then we're not going to ask for change, and then we're not going to get it. If we believe also that our healing depends on our spouse's change, that will also become a roadblock to change as well, because at the end of the day, you are not the relationship, you are your own person, and your healing in and of itself does not require your spouse's cooperation or participation. The relationship does, but again, your identity, your worth, and your value isn't the relationship. It is you as an individual. And so not having a strong, solid grasp of that, still putting the marriage or your spouse in that position of God, really, an idol that gives you your meaning, your identity, your value, your worth, and your purpose. If that's your idol, that will become a roadblock to change. So those are some things that get in the way for us as women, being able to allow there to be change in the relationship, because we get stuck actually in the trauma of it, big time. And so we've got to be able to get past that, to not be reactive, to be more aware of who we are, and in actuality learn to find our footing in who we are, not in what the circumstances are, or not in what he is or what he says. You know, for couples or individuals, whether you go through, you know, work together with us or are doing the group programs, some of the ways there is not change is that readiness to change, right? If you're not internally ready to hear, I need to change something, there likely is not going to be very much change, because you're going to be focused on the other person changing. You're going to disregard your own responsibility to plant your feet somewhere, to walk out your own steps. And you're going to be just putting all of the weight of responsibility on the other person to change something. And again, it could be the other person's total responsibility and need to change because they're the destructive person in the relationship. But even under that, there is still a prerogative to be healthy, to be grounded, to have a solid sense of self. And so we've got to be able to, again, separate the relationship from you as a person so that you as a person can find that footing. And then we can talk about how to deal with the relationship, whatever that might look like. I have had couples who have failed miserably in marriage intensives, namely for a couple of reasons. One is there's so much reactivity that we can't talk about anything. Either she takes offense to what he says because she is rightfully angry and traumatized and done with it. He takes offense to everything she says because he views everything as a prognosis of his value, of him, you know, not measuring up to something. So rather than being able to learn from the situation and use it to talk about what did we learn and what are we going to do with it, then we get stuck in those loops where it's all just arguing, fighting, yelling at each other, calling each other names, and swearing around me more than I usually like to hear. So that is a failure to me, when we cannot have a conversation where we're actually talking about, here's where we are, here's what we have to work on, here's how we're willing to collaborate. Because again, if there's no collaboration, no coming together in a conversation, you're not building a relationship. It's a one-way conversation. One person going this way, the other person going this way. It's not a relationship. So to find a healthy space in there, you've got to be able to talk about, what is this going to look like for us? What have we learned from what we have done? What do we need to do different? And if one or the other person isn't in that process, there's not going to be healing in the relationship. There can still be healing in you as an individual, however, because again, your identity, your worth, and your value isn't the relationship. It is in you as a person created by God for such a time as this. So we've got to be able to find that person as separate from the marriage, and then be able to bring that to the table to even talk about the marriage. If that's not happening, that will be a roadblock in there being any kind of change. Another element to keep in mind is with the impact of ongoing, lasting, continual, recurring trauma, everything is compounded. So when you have been in a relationship where you have learned essentially that your safety and your personhood is completely up to you to protect, to provide for, again, going back to that sense of self-protection and self-efficacy, you're going to view everything as a threat. And in viewing everything as a threat, it is really hard to allow there to be room for something to be different. Because part of what we find safety in, so to speak, is consistency. Even when that consistency is bad and you know what's coming, oddly enough, there's still a sense of safety in that to some extent because you know what's coming. Right? And to some extent, you've survived it before. So there's a piece of you that believes you can survive it again. And it's hard to let go of that this could be different because you've consistently had a different pattern. So that in itself can be a roadblock to change, because it's very hard to allow there to be room for something to be different because there's so much fear involved, because trauma has taught you to view everything as a threat. So that actually will be something that will need to be unpacked and worked through before we can really do healthy couples work together. And if there's still ongoing trauma happening in the marriage, there's not going to be any breakthrough in couples work either, because it still propels that idea. It accentuates that idea that no matter what, there is danger ahead. And with that being a part of the equation, that threat of danger, there's going to be very little ability to see change. Everything good is still going to be fit into this, but there's danger. When is the other shoe going to drop, for example? If you, as a victim, have learned to survive and have adapted to a consistent pattern of ugly behavior in such a way that, you know, you're still here, for example, it's going to be very, very, very hard for you to let go of those things that you've done to adapt, even if they're destructive in and of themselves, because in essence, that's what you've learned to do to survive, and that is something that you actually feel like you kind of control. And so when the rest of the world feels chaotic, there's that piece in there that's like, you can't let go of that, because you can't trust him to protect you and to provide for you. So it's kind of that sense of control. But that becomes a roadblock to change that will have to be worked through in order for you to be actually healthy, to have healthier responses, regardless of what happens with that marriage. So some of the skills needed to lay a good coaching foundation or a good counseling foundation are things like emotional regulation, self-awareness, assertive communication. I know these are all terms you've heard before, but really what they mean is, like for emotional regulation, it's just that idea that you are able to hold your own, to tolerate what's going on with you as you're hearing someone else talk without internalizing it as something about your identity, your worth, and your value. Like being able to know who you are and stay engaged in a conversation with someone else, knowing that they may be talking about you, but they're really telling you what they're thinking. They're telling you what their perspective is. And being able to separate that, not take it in as an offense, that's a key skill to learn. Being able to regulate what's going on in you so you can stay engaged and be able to use the environment, the conversation to inform your next steps. Not to just push you off a cliff, for example, but to actually take steps that are steadfast, informed, thoughtful, based on what you have heard, not based on the emotion you're feeling because of what you've heard. So there is a difference. Self-awareness is, kind of the same sort of thing. We often are, as women, are very codependent, which means we're very aware of how people are responding to us. So when I talk about self-awareness, I am saying pay attention to how you are affecting people, which is a little different nuance than how they are responding to you. But, we do want to care. We don't want to stomp all over people, right? We want to know how we're affecting people. But where we have to get out of the codependent cycle is not taking in their response as a definition of our identity, our worth, and our value. Like most of the time, we'll read into how people respond to us to mean something about who we are. And that's a roadblock to change. We don't find our identity in people unless we're steeped in codependency, and then we do. But not healthy. Our identity is that we are created by the Most High King, who has called us for a purpose, for such a time as this, and He is the one that gives us our identity. So we've got to be able to stay engaged in relationships, bringing ourselves to the table, paying attention to how we're affecting people, because that's emotional maturity, but not taking in their response as a definition of who we are. So not taking offense to their perspectives, for example, because they got all their own stuff going on. You have no idea what's going on in their head. And so the things coming out of their mouth are telling you who they are and what's going on in their head, not who you are. So learning how to separate that, having that self-awareness of being able to maintain your own sense of self in that place. And then assertive communication is simply the idea that you mean what you say what you mean, you're clear, you don't make people read your mind, and you don't try to read their mind. You give room for people to say what they need to say and use that information to take wise next steps. That's assertive. It's very different than aggressive. It's very different than passive. It's actually being real and authentic and offering something to build a relationship. The key in that is learning how to do that to the level of what someone else is offering you, meaning every relationship can only be as deep as the least deep person, right? And so part of maturity is being able to recognize someone's only offering me this much of a relationship, very shallow, and I can operate in that space. I can have conversations about the weather and what I did for Christmas, and it still be good, right? I might wish for something deeper, but they're not offering that. So I'm not going to demand it of them because whatever they've got going on, that's all they can offer me right now. So I can honor that and not lose sense of my own depth, right? That's a learned skill. So being able to do that with every relationship you're in, part of what that looks like, again, is not taking from that it means something about you, that all they can offer is that much, right? It doesn't say something about you. It says something about them. So learning to navigate that in healthy ways. Those are just some of the basic skills needed for there to be the ability to have a change process and really to walk in it. Otherwise, the roadblocks are such that we will get stuck doing what we've always done because of fear, because of trauma, because of just an inability to see beyond the next step. And so when we talk about a healing process, a pathway to healing, we've got to be able to deal with these roadblocks so that we clear the road of them, so to speak, and can move towards a place of healing no matter what happens with the relationship. Again, this is just driven first to help you be healthy so that you can bring yourself to the table with good boundaries, a strong sense of self, a good sense of direction, knowing who you are and where you're going, because that is the most important element necessary for there to even be a conversation to collaborate about building a relationship together. So there is a men's counterpart to this video. Dr. Hudson is doing one as well, talking about some of the roadblocks to change for men. I would encourage you to watch that as well. If you would like more information or to schedule a session with us, I encourage you to contact the Marriage Recovery Center at front desk at marriagerecoverycenter.com. Thank you so much for sitting in with me today. I hope it has been helpful, and I would love to see you sometime. So until then, take care.